Welcome back. You're watching HFO-TV.
Hi, welcome back to HFO-TV. I'm Greg Frick, partner at HFO Investment Real Estate. And today we have Angie Even from Save Portland Buildings. And Save Portland Buildings is a grassroots organization here in Portland who's been dealing with the city in the proposed URM seismic upgrades on existing projects. So thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
I know we've heard a lot about it in the last couple years about the seismic program the city is trying to incorporate or been talking about. Maybe you can give a little background to our audience as to kind of where we've been and where we are today, and we can then kind of get into some of the nuances.
Sure. This was started by Mayor Hills and Steve Novick in about 2014.
Okay.
And the reason why, one of the reasons why they decided to look at a mandate was because the existing code 2485, was not performing the way that they expected it to. So rather,
and that's for compliance with seismic on older projects.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, the buildings, when they got a roof replacement, they were supposed to get the roof retrofits.
Right.
And then if you did a change of use and or did a large remodel, then you would have to do the rest of the retrofits. One of the articles that came out in the very beginning of this process was Steve Novick is quoted in a Mercury article as saying that the building owners, if they hadn't done these change of use or these large remodels, that we were cheaters. And so that's where it started.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So the city's position was that building owners of unreinforced buildings were trying to, the cities, because they put in these changes, are the only reason why this thing came about.
Yeah, well, and also they identified the URM buildings as buildings being vulnerable to earthquakes.
Right.
And but also the other buildings that are identified are soft story and non-ductile concrete. And so, but they've started with the URMs because they had a 20-year-old list that they had a database, so that's where they've decided to start.
Okay.
And so what they did was they had 3 committees. One was a standards committee, one was a support, and one was a policy committee. And each of those committees had a different task. The first was to figure out the engineering, the second, the finances and the funding and how people were going to pay for it, and thirdly was what was going to happen to the people, so displacement.
Okay, displacement of existing tenants or...
Right,
okay.
Right.
And how did those committees communicate well together based on what you've seen over the years, or?
What we saw was that there was a common thread of engineers that went through the thread. So they had 1 or 2 people that continued through the process. And what I observed the most was the policy committee, of which that was where they were supposed to have a resolution of how this was going to work, a plan.
Right.
And what I've seen with the 3 committees is that the engineering was solid. In the finance and funding committee, all roads led to nothing. And the 3rd committee, the policy committee, whenever the problems and the questions, especially from building owners, came in, they'd always revert back to the mechanics or the engineering.
Right.
Yeah. So we have a policy proposal that's heavy on engineering, short on funding and financing, and short on a plan for what's going to happen to the people if they get displaced out of these buildings.
And currently, right now, I know the city just put up their kind of their policy committee report.
Right.
I mean, where are we today in terms of where the city is? And I mean, are we up for, is the policy committee ready to start putting something in place? I know there's been timelines that we've heard for last year. It's going to be done by, this date, and then it's pushed out to this date. Where's the update on, in March of 2018 of where we are today? And
well, it was supposed to go to City Council this month. And
right.
I was actually in the mayor's office yesterday, not with the mayor, but 2 of his staff. And what they told us was that they're considering taking this to City Council probably sometime in March or April, and then they're going to not pass an ordinance, but they're going to vote on a resolution. So what they told me was that then it would be out of the committee's hands, and it would go to Development Services and the Bureau of Emergency Management to come up with the final draft. Keeping in mind that it was the Bureau of Emergency Management and Development Services that have been working on this for 4 years and haven't been able to come up with solutions or answers to questions from building owners.
So the city's just going to kind of throw it back in their lap again and see what they come up with.
Yeah, and the one thing that was alarming about that was that we asked about what the public process was going to be in that, and we were told that meetings by 1 or 2 building owners or anybody that's coming to City Hall and taking meetings with staff was public process. And so what we think is fair at this point, because there was no representation of any commercial building owners or building businesses or okay, so I'll do that again, because there was no representation for small business building owners and businesses and residents, that a Citizens Advisory Committee needs to be formed in order to help shape whatever policy or not that they do.
That's not too unusual with the city. We've seen is they'll say they're doing a stakeholders meeting and it's a very limited stakeholders involved, or they've already got kind of the agenda already planned out, so they'll make sure the people involved are following that agenda.
Yeah.
It's kind of talks about some of the communications that we've had issues with the city in terms of policies or what they're asking for. I mean, it sounds like you guys are experiencing some of that same thing in terms of the communication with the city to various people that have a stakeholder, building owners, tenants, commercial, residential, all the way across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. The city sent out the one postcard in August of 2016. They actually had 9% response to that postcard. And there hasn't been a notification since then.
And that's the one that went out to the owners.
That's the one that went out to the owners.
Because then I know the city also sent out postcards to residents.
They did, and they had, it was less than 1% responded. There was 7,000 residential units are part of this.
Right.
And I think it was under 50 people showed up at that meeting.
And then the other question we've kind of had is regarding, the city's been kind of talking and trying to mandate, affordable housing. They've done IZ zoning, they've done other things that they've tried to incorporate. I mean, where do you see the disconnect between the city and affordable housing with this kind of policy? Or how are they trying to connect those two? It's an interesting.
Well, it's interesting because there's low-income housing and there's affordable housing.
Right.
And low-income housing, the city owns, or the city, the city owns 1,800 units of low-income housing that are in URMs. There's 278 buildings, and of those buildings, most of those buildings are naturally affordable. And so I know that the trend for cities is to want to take down buildings and put up big buildings with density and so forth, but there's absolutely no proof that results in affordability.
Right.
And so I believe that what we're looking for is a balance between the historical buildings and the buildings that create the character of our city with safety. And in order to do that, the city needs to talk to owners.
On the funding side, I mean, what have they thrown out in regards to, the mechanism to help fund this or offset some of the costs? Because, we've heard, wide gamuts of what it would cost to do a URM building. Again, in our audience is mostly apartment owners.
Right.
What have they talked about ways to, if they try to put something in place? I mean, how is an owner going to afford to do something, or is this, do they walk away from the building? Do they, look at finding a developer that says, hey, I'll just, scrape the building? I mean, what's the city's answer been kind of regarding that?
The two main things that they're proposing for the buildings, one is called property fit. It's the old CPACE program. And CPACE was an energy loan that you could receive for energy projects on your building. They want to expand that for the retrofits, but there are a couple of problems for building owners. One is it excludes nonprofits. And the second is that the CPACE program is expensive, and I guess there's three. And the third is that if you have a mortgage on your building, the bank has to agree to be second lien on your building. And building owners have called banks, and banks are saying no.
No, they're not going to take a subordinate position, even if it's for an energy. So, okay, so it's like the energy upgrade program they did years ago.
It's attached to, it's billed on your property tax statement. The money's expensive. It's over 6% interest. So for building owners, that's a non-starter, especially if you have a mortgage.
Right.
And it doesn't help the nonprofits or the churches or anybody.
Which is a large percentage of nonprofits have these buildings.
Absolutely, yeah. And so the second is what's called SB 311, and that was passed at the state level, but it has not been encoded yet. But what it does, it gives the city of Portland the opportunity and the right to develop a tax abatement plan. And what they're looking at is they're looking at not only taking funding away from schools, but also parks and anybody else that's on our regular property tax statement.
To fund
the buildings.
To fund, okay.
Yeah, and the thing about that program is that the inequity, well, first of all, they're saying it's 10 plus 5 years, but we don't know what that means. And Peggy Moretti from Restore Oregon had reported at one of the meetings that what she had seen with that program, because they have to get 75% of the stakeholders to sign off that they'll not take those they'll be reduced by those property taxes, is they see them pay it out over a longer amount of years.
Oh, okay.
There's no upfront funding with that. You have to be able to find your own funding and
to do the improvements, and
then you get a drip of tax abatements over a number of years. And one of the other problems with that is it's inequitable, because in our property tax base, building that sits in a lower economic area of Portland will have fewer benefits from SB 311 than a building that's in a higher economic area, even though the retrofits would be lateral on a similar building. So that's an issue.
And in the city, I mean, I know like I said, they've got a plan, but it seems all over the place. I mean, are they pretty much now set in stone in terms of the engineering side as to what they want done, or expectation of what they want done? Now it's a matter of finding funding and doing policy, or are they still kind of working that out? The
last that we know is that the 1 and 2 building, class 1 and 2 buildings, which are the schools and critical buildings, are at a life safety standard.
Okay.
But the Class 3 buildings are at what they call roof retrofits, so that's the cornices, parapets, and chimneys, and also full roof replacement, because it'll be roof sheathing. And then the second, and that's within, they're saying that's within 10 years. And then,
so they're giving you, in theory, a 10-year window.
10-year window. Okay. And then within the next 5 years, then you would have to do the bolts plus, so that would be attaching the floors to the walls.
Got it, got it. For that class. And then what are they doing for the class 1?
For class 4, the last one, those are the 1 and 2 story buildings that have fewer occupants, and what they're saying is those buildings just have to do the retrofits, the roof retrofit.
The roof, okay, got it, based on the stories and the number of occupants, okay.
Yeah.
And then what are they saying for the class 1, the schools, and, I mean, where's the funding coming for? For that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because Jen Schoen from Portland Public Schools was on the committee, and when they did their final committee, what she said was that she did not want the city of Portland to put 1,600 buildings on the same timeline as schools to compete for not only funding, but also for contractors.
Yeah, right.
That was going to make it more expensive and more difficult for the schools to get it done. So we agree with that, and most of the building owners that I talk to, they're not happy about the fact that schools need to get done, but yet this SB 311 is going to do some defunding of school revenue.
Right, so you're taking pulling out money from one to do something else, and you're still not addressing the overriding issue.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, where do you think this is going to go? I mean, like I said, the city seems to have continually pushed this out.
Yeah.
I know there's been, there's your grassroots organization, which has done a great job in trying to communicate. Maybe, as we've had in our, in our world with a lot of investors, it's, a lot of times there's a kind of a gap in communication. So, how do we get the message out that, hey, there's time to act? And I think, Save Portland Buildings has done a great job with that. Where do you think this is going in, in 18? Like I said, the policy's been kind of the can seems to be being kicked down the road. Where do you think we're going to be?
Yeah, that's interesting. Carmen Merlo, who was the director of Bureau of Emergency Management, is no longer the director.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, and so with Steve Novick being the champion of this and Carmen being the person that picked up the ball to take it over the line, it's not really clear who the champion of this is.
Because both Steve Novak's no longer in office, and she's moved on to a different position.
She has, yeah. So what we see happening, hopefully, is that the city will understand that every building is different, that there's 1,640 buildings on this list. 81% of them are storefront commercial or small Main Street buildings.
Got it.
And that I think it's 74% of them are 1- and 2-story buildings. So we're not talking about big buildings. We're talking about small buildings and small owners.
Infill, 2-story commercial storefront properties.
Absolutely, yeah. An example of that is there's 40 buildings on Hawthorne Boulevard, and there's 54 in St. John's and 28 in Multnomah Village. And when you talk about that number of buildings and those small building owners, and a lot of them are owner-operators, they're businesses that were able to buy the small old building afford it so that they could control their own rent. And so when you look at that as along with the different financial structures of every family that owns these buildings, I don't see how they can use a broad brush approach without seeing a lot of demolitions, a lot of building closures, and a lot of developers coming in and tearing these buildings down. And that's what we're telling them. We're telling them if they don't make it, if it's not feasible and they don't look at every building owner individually, what we're doing is we're just kicking it down the road for the building owner as well, because they're not going to be able to do it, and what's going to happen is the developer is going to end up tearing the building down eventually. So it really basically feels like a death sentence on our buildings.
On some of those, yeah. Like I said, feasibility, if it doesn't work from a financial standpoint, at some point it's, if I can't put the money in to do this improvement, then what do we do and what am I left with? So we've seen that on, trying to market and sell some unreinforced buildings. The sellers know that something's coming, the buyers know something's coming, nobody knows what it's going to be, nobody knows the cost structure, nobody knows the time frame. So then how do you handle all that? And from a lending standpoint, it's been an issue as well. So
so I think what it comes down to is the building owners are getting backed into a corner, and our options are getting fewer.
But is there still the chance to kind of communicate with the city, or is it, are we feeling like some of the other policies they put in place, it's it's already kind of predetermined and they'll just listen to the voices they want to listen to? Or do you feel, there's ability to still kind of mobilize, I guess, more so than we have?
Yeah, I think that's the crux of it, is that whenever there's something that happens that the building owners are trying to get an answer to a question or find out what the solution is to the problem, we're overreacting, or we're overstating, or we're doing something. But then we go to City Hall, and what we find is that they only know one side of the story. They know the side that is palatable in order to pass this thing.
Got it.
And so what our mission has been is to get the information out.
Okay.
And one of the things, we've met with the mayor, we've met with counselors, we've met with staff. They're very receptive to us, but nothing's changing as far as our ability to get through to them that this is definitely a policy without a plan, and that's never a good idea.
Right, right. So for people that want to get more information with your group, they can go to the website, which is down below the screen. I want to thank you for coming in and sharing this about the City of Portland. Thank you again for coming from HFO-TV, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Our entire office specializes in multifamily real estate, making HFO the largest multifamily brokerage in the Pacific Northwest. Your success is our passion. Build your legacy with HFO. Call 503-241-5541 or visit our website at hfore.com for more information.